On the night of April 13th, 1970, three astronauts were halfway to the moon when a single explosion changed everything. The spacecraft shook violently. Warning lights flashed across the cockpit. Commander Jim Lovell looked out of the window and saw a white cloud drifting into the darkness of space. It wasn't smoke, it wasn't fuel, it was oxygen. In that moment, the moon no longer mattered. More than 200,000 miles from Earth, Apollo 13 had become a spacecraft fighting to stay alive. Over the next 4 days, NASA would attempt the greatest rescue mission in the history of spaceflight. But to understand how three astronauts ended up stranded in deep space, we have to go back to the beginning. By 1970, America believed it had mastered the moon. Apollo 11 had made history by landing the first humans on its surface. Just months later, Apollo 12 proved it wasn't a lucky success. Moon missions were becoming routine. Public excitement began to fade. Television networks reduced their live coverage, and many people barely noticed when Apollo 13 was preparing for launch. To most Americans, it was simply another trip to the moon. No one imagined it would become the most famous mission NASA never wanted. Apollo 13 was commanded by Jim Lovell, one of NASA's most experienced astronauts. After 3 successful space missions, this was finally supposed to be the flight where he walked on the moon. Beside him was Fred Hayes, making his very first journey into space. The third crew member, Jack Swigert, wasn't even supposed to be on the mission. Just 3 days before launch, another astronaut was removed after being exposed to German measles. Swigert became his replacement with barely enough time to prepare. At the time, it seemed like an unfortunate last-minute change. No one knew that decision would soon become part of one of NASA's greatest survival stories. On April 11, 1970, the giant Saturn V rocket lifted off from Kennedy Space Center with more than 7.5 million pounds of thrust. Everything worked perfectly. Within minutes, Apollo 13 reached orbit. Soon after, another engine burn sent the spacecraft on its 3-day journey toward the moon. The mission settled into a routine. The crew performed system checks, conducted experiments, photographed Earth, and even recorded a television broadcast from space. Ironically, almost nobody watched. One network ended the broadcast early because there simply wasn't much public interest. Apollo 13 had become too ordinary to make headlines. Then, on the evening of April 13th, Mission Control asked the crew to perform one final routine task before they went to sleep. "Okay, Jack, let's stir the oxygen tanks." It was a procedure they'd completed many times before. Jack Swigert reached for the switch, turned it on, and seconds later a deafening explosion ripped through the spacecraft. Nothing about Apollo 13 would ever be ordinary again. For a few seconds after the explosion, no one knew what had happened. Warning lights flashed across every panel as the spacecraft continued racing toward the moon. Jack Swigert quickly checked the instruments while Jim Lovell looked back through the window. The white cloud was still there, only now it was impossible to ignore. Apollo 13 wasn't just leaking oxygen, it was losing the very resource that powered the spacecraft and kept its crew alive. Back on Earth, Mission Control watched the telemetry in disbelief. One oxygen tank had completely failed. The second was rapidly losing pressure. Without oxygen, the fuel cells could no longer produce electricity. And without electricity, the command module would eventually lose navigation, communication, and life support. Within minutes, NASA made the only decision it could. The moon landing was canceled. From that moment on, the mission had only one objective: bring the crew home alive. But there was one problem. The spacecraft built to carry them safely back to Earth was slowly dying. Flight Director Gene Kranz and his team searched for any possible solution. There was no rescue spacecraft waiting to launch, no emergency plan for an explosion this far from Earth. The only chance was the lunar module. Designed to support 2 astronauts on the Moon for less than 2 days, it would now have to keep all 3 crew members alive for nearly 4 days. It wasn't designed for that, but it was their only hope. The astronauts carefully shut down the command module to preserve its remaining battery power for re-entry. One by one, the lights went out. The computers fell silent. The spacecraft that had carried them toward the Moon became little more than an empty shell. Now, the lunar module had become their lifeboat. At first, the plan seemed to work. Then the next problem appeared. The lunar module carried enough water for 2 astronauts, not 3. Mission Control immediately ordered strict rationing. Each crew member received only a small amount of water each day. The heaters remained off to save electricity, and temperatures inside the spacecraft dropped close to freezing. The crew wore every layer of clothing they had, yet they still shivered through the darkness. Then another threat quietly emerged. Carbon dioxide levels began rising. The lunar module's air filters had never been designed for 3 people. If the gas continued to build, the astronauts would slowly lose consciousness. Back in Houston, engineers searched for a solution using only the same materials available on board: plastic bags, cardboards, hoses, flight manuals, and plenty of duct tape. After hours of testing, they created a simple adapter that allowed a square filter from the command module to fit into the lunar module's round system. The astronauts assembled it exactly as instructed. Everyone waited. Then the carbon dioxide levels began to fall. The crew could breathe again. But although they had solved one problem after another, the most dangerous moment of the mission was still waiting for them. With the carbon dioxide problem solved, Apollo 13 finally had a chance to survive. But the hardest part of the mission still lay ahead. The damaged spacecraft was now looping around the far side of the Moon, using its gravity to begin the long journey back to Earth. Outside the windows, the gray lunar surface drifted silently beneath them. For Jim Lovell, it was a heartbreaking sight. After years of training, he had come all this way to walk on the Moon. Instead, he could only watch it disappear behind him. The dream was over. Now, getting home was the only goal that mattered. As Apollo 13 raced toward Earth, the crew faced one final critical maneuver. To safely enter Earth's atmosphere, they had to perform a precise engine burn. Normally, the spacecraft's guidance computer would handle the job, but to save power, most of the systems had been shut down. The astronauts would have to guide the spacecraft almost entirely by hand. Using a stopwatch, handwritten procedures, and the Earth's horizon through a small window, Jim Lovell carefully aligned Apollo 13. The engine fired. For just a few seconds, every calculation had to be perfect. Too little thrust, and they would miss Earth completely. Too much, and the spacecraft would burn up during re-entry. When the burn was complete, there was no way to know if they had succeeded. All they could do was wait. On April 17, 1970, Apollo 13 finally reached Earth. Before re-entry, the crew returned to the command module, hoping the batteries they had carefully preserved for 4 days would still be enough to power the spacecraft. One by one, the systems came back to life. It worked. Then the capsule struck Earth's atmosphere at nearly 25,000 miles per hour. A blazing layer of superheated plasma surrounded the spacecraft, cutting off all radio communication. Mission Control expected the blackout to last about 3 minutes. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 3, still nothing. The silence inside Mission Control became unbearable. Then, after 4 long minutes, a familiar voice finally broke through the radio. Apollo 13 had survived. Moments later, 3 bright parachutes opened above the Pacific Ocean as the command module splashed safely into the water. Recovery crews quickly reached the capsule, and Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes emerged exhausted, but alive. Apollo 13 never landed on the moon. By its original objective, the mission had failed. Yet today, it is remembered as one of NASA's greatest achievements. Because sometimes success isn't reaching your destination. Sometimes success is simply bringing everyone home. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more documentaries exploring the moments that changed history.